born to Frisco Bay, way out in California.
And we're very fortunate today to have our member, David Herzl, here. He's been in Pacifica 5 years. He's a contractor, and he is a residential green building designer. He's been instrumental on working with our Green Building Policy Committee here in Pacifica, as well as being a member of the restoration team at the Little Brown Church. He's been interested in polar exploration for many, many years, and he is head of the Living History Program. He runs the Living History Program at the Maritime Museum. So with that, I want to say thank you, David, and I'll turn the microphone over to him.
My talk is about maritime history. A maritime history that eventually sort of focuses on this coast side. It's right out here. This is really nice where we live. Is this cool or what? We have this area of coast right here from Lower Baja and on up going this way, where we live now, that was unknown. And Cabrillo left in a sailing ship. I think when I got a timeline here, I'm not sure if I can keep complete track of all this. 1542, 20 years after Magellan had come around and gone up and sailed across, 1542. There was already kind of pretty heavy Spanish trading going on up and down here, and Spanish-oriented communities were growing up and down this coast right along here. So Cabrillo said, well, I think I'll go up north, or he was sent north by the governor of Old Mexico. I think I'll go north and I'll see what's up there, and he coasted all along and sailed right off out here. And he didn't stop. He just sailed, and he sort of determined, well, this looks like kind of the limit of what must be the continent. I didn't find any holes in it, so the continent must be like here. But he didn't stop anywhere and didn't really get close enough to get a handle on what it was that he had seen. Portola was sent up overland. So there was this idea that these Spanish-Mexican explorers had of the legendary Monterey Bay, or this Monterey Bay that's right down here. They didn't exactly know where it was. They only had an idea that it existed. That's how infirm their notion from these sort of offshore sailings was they sailed right by various things. So Portola was sent up from San Diego to discover the Monterey Bay, and he went overland, then he missed it. And he ended up, you know where he ended up right here in Sweeney Ridge. And he looked over and he saw the San Francisco Bay, and he said, that's pretty amazing. This whole inland sea, what a remarkable thing that was to discover the San Francisco Bay. But there was no way just then to manipulate it, to make money out of it. So Portola went back and he said, well, I didn't find Monterey Bay, but I found San Francisco Bay. And so then some bodega was sent north along in a ship to find the mouth to San Francisco Bay, and he passed it. He went up and he discovered Bodega Bay, and which is a very kind of nice place. No gold up there, at least not at the moment. As of this time, there's no commerce happening yet, though. There's no trade happening. There hasn't been any pockets of gold discovered that made any of this really worthwhile for exploitation. The discovery of San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate, that sort of started to open a few things up. It made a logical way to extend the Mission Trail farther on up as far as Sonoma. It opened up possibilities along the inland waterway, up, through San Pablo Bay and up that way, up towards the Sacramento River. So it kind of did start to open things up then. And little by little, our California coast was getting better and better known. So I'm sure you've all heard of the book 2 Years Before the Mass with Richard Henry Dana, which is a wonderful book if you can get a hold of it and read it. And this really kind of starts to describe in detail trade on the California coastline. Trade for what I have here that is not worth much that I can take back there and sell. So Richard Henry Dana's trips on board the Pilgrim were for hides, cow hides, that were grown in California. Down more towards the lower part of California, a little bit south from where we are. So they sent the ship out from Boston because they had shoe factories in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was getting known for shoes. And so they had this insatiable demand for leather. And the best way to make money out of this whole process is, where's the cheapest place you can possibly get leather? You can go out to California, and even though it's a really, really, really long trip, a long and arduous trip to get there and very dangerous, if we pay our sailors nothing, or very little, and we go out there and the Spanish people out there don't really appreciate the value of the hides that they have, so they don't really kind of know to charge us as much as we'd be willing to pay. So we can send a ship out there, stuff it full of hides, come back, and after all that trouble, the merchants who sent that ship out there will be filthy rich. They'll turn those hides loose, they'll give them to the shoe manufacturers, and the money will come pouring into the merchants. It won't come in to the sailors at all. And so how did they get these hides? Because there are no ports. There are no ports anywhere in California. There are very few English-speaking people anywhere in California. The Mexican, they're basically herders. There's the missions. The missions along the Mission Trail, and their produce was the herds, and so they were herders. So they grow the cows, and cows just grew naturally. They slaughter the cows, they tan the hides. How they get them out to the ship when there's no port? They'd load them in surf boats. And so you get a detailed description from Dana about this, which is, you kind of go, well, that's nuts. That's amazing. That's so much work, it's so much effort, it's so dangerous. They'd bring an empty boat, they'd put it on the beach, they'd fill it as full as they could possibly fill it with hides, launch it into the breaking surf, row it out to the ship, unload it, and then do the same thing over and over and over and over again until the ship was packed from the very bottom of the floor down by the keel to the beams that hold the deck, packed as solid as it could get with hides. And those hides go back, they take it to Massachusetts, and they turn it into money. Well, they turn it into shoes and sell the shoes for money. The profit motive. But also you get a nice, interesting looks at early California from Richard Henry Dana in his book. And he did actually make it up, I think, as far as the Presidio up here. And at that time, San Francisco was, well, it was a mission. I mean, there was nothing there. It was a mission. It was a few tents, a little kind of cardboard shack city almost, what there was of it. But that would change. That was going to change. And the thing that changed it, and you all know what changed it, was they discovered gold at Sutter's Fort in 1848. And all of a sudden, it makes sense to develop California. All of a sudden, San Francisco had a place on the map. And it was actually just past where we live right here, that place. And overnight, every ship that could float on the East Coast, every ship that even if it didn't float very well, but the pumps worked, every ship that you could possibly find a sailor to run was chartered and came around here. And in the space of about a year and a half, by 1850, there were 775 abandoned ships in San Francisco that had brought all these gold rushers out. So all these people kind of influxed in so they could get past San Francisco. They'd drop everything, get past San Francisco, and go up to the gold fields and get rich. Well, if you study gold rushes at all, which I've studied a few. I studied the Yukon gold rush up here. There's been gold rushes in Australia. The people that were there that found the gold, that was the gold. Everybody else that came a month later came and said, well, all the good places have been claimed. Huh? But it took a long, long time for the news to get back to the East Coast that, you know, maybe this isn't really the greatest idea. So here's this great influx of people, but that's where the money is. The money is not the gold. The money is the commerce. What drives us to go and create cities where no cities were is not the gold that might be there or that was thought to be there. It's once the people are there, they need goods and services and food, and it's the commerce. And here's that word that comes again. It's the commerce, that trade. So some kind of little subsidiary trades kind of developed. I mean, there was a lot of gold happening around San Francisco. There was a lot there. It was moving around. It was changing hands. It was all, the claims were largely taken, was the point I wanted to make. So there was gold out in the Farallones. It just took a certain kind of way of looking at the world to understand that the gold inside a seabird's egg yolk is still gold. So the Farallones, all of a sudden, which were for millennia completely undisturbed, there was millions and millions and millions of seabirds out there, and they all laid eggs. And just as soon as one enterprising person said, you know what, I bet we could just go out there and pick up eggs and we'll bring them back in baskets, and they'd sell them. Eggs, ounce of gold. Now, they didn't necessarily all sell for an ounce of gold, but it was fairly easy to find a buyer. So what happens immediately? Like, one enterprising person, 5 enterprising persons have boats out there, and they're all climbing up the rocks, and they're all getting all the bird's eggs they can without a thought to the notion that if there aren't any little birds at the end of this season, there's going to be, you know, less bigger birds to make little birds for the next season, because this is how we are. This is what we're like. This is humanity. And you know this goes on today. You know this goes on with our fishing business, for instance. It's sort of like, not necessarily that we in California, because we actually take some care to regulate this. It's other nations and other states in the world that are like taking all the fish, taking all the whales, and it just happens, and then there's nothing to make the little ones. Anyway, it's a big egg business, and then they had egg wars out there. Then they had big bloody fights over the territories. They divvied up the Farallon Islands, like who could get the eggs and eggs and eggs. Eventually that did end. It doesn't have as many seabirds as it used to out there, the Farallones. But you look out there and you see them, and if you've been out there, if you've been close enough by boat to see, they're really pretty desert. There's nothing out there, but there were eggs. And so the miners, what do they need? Well, they need shovels. The smart man comes in and sets up a hardware store. That's what Collis P. Huntington did. He did a hardware store up in Sacramento, and he sold shovels and Levi jeans and whatnot, what the miners needed, because that's where the money is. And Collis P. Huntington ended up being one of the richest people that you can imagine. From what? From a hardware store. Commerce, trade. Where did the shovels come from? Back here. So now we started having a kind of trade situation that went back and forth around that way, both ways. Now we have business. We have transit routes going up and down the coast, and we have ways of getting in and out, or sort of ways of getting in and out. So we have, when San Francisco, if you go and you look in the older neighborhoods, all the houses are heartwood redwood. You go in, they're beautiful, they're all wood. Where'd that redwood come from? Some from the north coast, a lot from the south coast. So some of the redwood was cut and run down to Redwood City, which is called that because Redwood City was a redwood export port. So on that side it was relatively easy to develop some port facilities and get some of the redwood out this way. But on this side over here, down Botano and Big Basin and down that way, and not too far down here, Tunitas Creek. Well, how are you going to get the wood out on that side? Because there's nothing that resembles a port on this side here, but ingenuity. Is there a way to find a way to get a buck out of this? If we can get the lumber, which costs us practically nothing, and get it down and somehow get it into the ships and sell it and do this in a big way, we'll all be rich. So anyway, I might be making a bit much of this point here, but I'm trying to make a point that it drives us all. There was a chute out here. Gordon's Chute, yes, Gordon's Chute. And if you ever saw a picture of Gordon's Chute, you'd say, what? What are you doing? Why would you do that? That's not going to last. So you see it better driving north from down Santa Cruz way. When you get to Tunitas Creek and you're looking out and you're kind of looking over, and there's those cliffs, and they look just like our cliffs up here. They're really soft sand cliffs like these ones that are given way up here. Up on Esplanade. But they're a lot higher. So, and they started growing wheat. And they started growing food up there because they want to get it out, get it down, and sell it to the cities, and they built this from this cliff, which is 180 feet high. They built this chute that goes down like that to where the water's deep enough where a ship can dock and they can load it. And they built it with these big stacks of cribbing, largely going out, kind of diminishing. It's 190 feet high. And so they can like push the stuff off at the top and it'll slide down and they can load the ship that way. And just, yeah, that's a good idea, except it's called Pacific, but it's really not very calm. In fact, the waves get up and they really kind of destroy anything that man intends to put down there in their way. And when you see a picture of Gordon's chute, you think, well, really? Good luck with that. And so it was destroyed after 5 or 6 years, and then they rebuilt it, and then it was destroyed again. And as a means of transiting off, that didn't work. But it was later on, but the idea of the Ocean Shore Railroad was to really serve this kind of coastal commerce that couldn't go out to ships. But the other thing, how do we get the lumber? How do we get the redwood out from the canyons up here? And they would log the trees and they would drag them out with ox teams, big, huge teams of ox, and they'd cut them up into lumber. And then they'd have a sling. They'd anchor a smaller, kind of more shallow draft lumber schooner offshore as close as it could possibly be in, which might be, less than 1,000 feet, long enough, just whatever would be the length that a steel cable could go down from the cliff top and carry a big old stack of lumber and just let it down and load the ship that way. Really dangerous for the ships, really problematic, dangerous for the people that are trying to do this work. But that's how they did it, because they could take that lumber. There was a demand for that lumber that they could take and go sell. Coming up a little bit further, I mean, we did have in Half Moon Bay, before it was known as Half Moon Bay, it was Amesport. And it was Amesport because Mr. Ames built a large wharf out into the water so that the produce of the lumber and the agricultural produce of Half Moon Bay could be offloaded from Half Moon Bay. So that became, but it never was a port because there's no encircling arms to really kind of shelter it down there. We had Amesport. Now, when it comes to exploitation, because that's kind of what we humans do, is we go and we exploit. I mentioned Ano Nuevo earlier, and the fact that they didn't really find any gold there, but they found elephant seals. And if you're familiar with the elephant seals, they're about half the size of an elephant, and they're full of fat. You can kill them and butcher them and render the oil out and use it to light lamps. You can sell the oil or package the oil into big kegs and send it to the cities and use it to burn the oil lamps into people's homes and in the streets right there. So just as kind of soon as somebody noticed this, was like, well, there's a demand for oil, and here's all these great big huge, really slow, really stupid animals, and all we have to do is go down on the beach and club them and cut them up and boil them down, and we'll have big vats of oil that we can sell. And that's a really interesting story, the elephant seals, because we had a gigantic population here of elephant seals all up and down the coast, and they all were killed off. The whole population was killed down to a very few individuals in pursuit of $1. And it took very stringent, very careful conservation efforts. It kind of began in about the mid to late 70s to prevent these populations, these elephant seal populations, from disappearing altogether. And we were successful at that. But of course, and now they're spreading, right? So colonies are going up. They started, Ano Nuevo was the last pocket. Now they're down to Ano Nuevo, and they're coming up this way, and they're going farther down the coast and populating and growing. Devonport down the coast, and a little bit further up at Pigeon Point, there were whaling stations. But just right on the beach, and they'd launch the wooden boats from the beach. They'd see some whales, and they'd row out, and with the harpoons, just like in Moby Dick, and harpoon the whale, kill it, drag it back in, render it on the beach. And so we have some kind of whaling ports now that went up later in the 1800s, until, of course, that source petered out because it was not remotely managed carefully. how else did we make money off the sea? And I'm not really an expert in this, and I suspect that there are people in this room who know more about this. Bootlegging. So, down where the Miramar Beach House is today, there was a different building in the same place, and they had their own wharf that ran out. And I'm told, but I don't know, you know, that illegal Canadian whiskey came in that way. And come up a little further and you have a place down in Moss Beach, the distillery. And that has a certain reputation for the same kind of thing. And there's actually, there's like a concrete marker a little bit ways off the water out there. And people have said that they used to have a cable out there, and they winched cases of whiskey up from out there up to the distillery. But I tend to think that you had to be a little more, just a little bit more discreet about how you shipped in your volatilely illegal material. And then, of course, there's a building in Pacifica. I think they call it the Castle. And I understand that has some kind of history, but actually I don't know anything about that. I know that there are people here that could speak about that. We have some shipwrecks that have happened. I didn't want to get out of here without talking about shipwrecks. There was a ship called I think this is the New York, is the one I'm thinking about, was making one of these long tacks, having come around, and was coming in from the direction of Hawaii, and thought, and kind of had a fairly good read from a couple days out where he was, where he was in relation to things. And he thought he was pointed into the Golden Gate. And he went into a fog and was so confident of where he thought he was, he didn't find out until he washed up on the beach at Half Moon Bay. And what would happen is like, because of this onshore wind, there's a fair amount of shipwrecks. We had one out here, the Sonora was out here, and there's a bunch up in San Francisco, and the Gifford piled up on Muscle Rock in 1903, and a bunch down at Half Moon Bay. In 2001, I read an article, showed up in the Half Moon Bay Review where I was living, and a hiker down there on the beach down there, up a little bit inland from the beach, discovered some human bones. And what's the first thing you do? Well, you call the police. You don't know what these are, so he called the police, and the police came down, and they all looked, and they thought, well, they're pretty old, but they didn't really know what they were. And it turns out it took some kind of some forensic science and some help from a university to determine that these were the graves of some men from the shipwreck Sir John Franklin that crashed down there in 1856. It was right after the 49ers, and it was kind of like the commerce, the trade was really starting to kind of pick up as a regular kind of thing. And the ship went it crashed in the rocks there at Ano Nuevo, and they salvaged what they could, and they saved what men they could, and the men that they couldn't save that died in the shipwreck, they buried them, they gave them an unmarked burial on the beach. And there it remained until it was discovered in 2001. And you can go down there now. I went down there because I'm interested in anything having to do with ships and shipwrecks. And I went down there and I asked about it, and they don't want to tell you where. If you go to the state park and you say you want to go where this is, they don't want to tell you where it is. They really don't want people to know. They don't want it to be this kind of tourist attraction. Because what they did was they reburied the remains that they had. They reburied them deeper, and then they built a great big kind of flat observation deck over it so that no one will disturb it right there. I bypassed an important part of my talk. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I want to go back to the gold rush. So I want to talk a little bit about how these square rig ships worked. They worked from, and you may or may not know this, but on a square rig ship, and I encourage you to go to San Francisco Maritime National Park and visit the Balclutha, which is a very typical Cape Horn ship from the trade from the great days of the square rig ships. She built in 1886, and she made from England and Germany, she made this round trip about 18 times, all under sail. The neat thing about a sailing ship is you don't waste any cargo space on engines or fuel, so it's all commerce. You batten down the hatches and the whole thing is full of trade goods of one kind or another. And all the men live up on the deck, largely exposed to the weather and the whims of their captains and officers. And all the work that happens by hand. So some of the work is really hard. There's a lot. When you have a sailing ship and it's under sail, and you have a main course sail that is easily as big as this floor, and it's full of wind because the wind is blowing really hard, and it's wet because it's been raining. We're talking tons and tons and tons of weight on tension on this sail. And so if we need to change the angle of that sail, if we need to brace the yard around because the wind is changing, so we need to brace the yard around, it's all done with muscle power on the parts of the sailors. And it's done by hauling on lines. Many of the lines run kind of horizontally along the deck, and the men have to haul on the line like so. And if you have 8 men, and they are, generally speaking, they're all men on board these ships. You have 8 men, they have to haul in unison, because if they're all doing this, and that thing weighs tons, nobody's going to have a hold of it. So how do we coordinate this? American sailing ships are well known for the use of the shantyman. And the shantyman sings a work song, and in the course of the work song, on the chorus, there are certain beats of the chorus that you pull. And you pull only on those beats of the chorus. So during the gold rush, there was a famous song that I'm going to teach you all. It's called Santiano. It has different people call it different names, it has different verses and different melodies. If you've heard it, you might not have heard this. We're sailing down the river from Liverpool, heave away, Santiano, around Cape Horn to Frisco Bay, way out in California. So heave her up and away we'll go, heave away, Santiano. Heave her up and away we'll go, all along the plains of Mexico. Back in the days of '49, heave away, Santiano. Those were the days of the good old times, way out in California. So heave her up and away we'll go, heave away, Santiano. This part too. Heave her up and away we'll go, all along the plains of Mexico. When I get home, I'll settle down, heave away, Santiano, and marry a gal named Sally Brown.